Now that we have an idea of what is considered in environmental health, let's look at the tools that we can use to address the burden of disease related to environmental exposure. There are four basic assessment tools, those being a risk assessment, a public health assessment, an ecological risk assessment, and an interaction analysis approach. Our interaction with our environment is complex. Risk assessment attempts to measure the potential impact of known hazards, evaluate the impact of environmental exposures one at a time, and to measure the types and magnitudes of the impacts. If a substantial risk is found to exist, the process then reviews options to protect, detect, and react to the risk to minimize the burden of disease on humans. We should expect to find the following issues that impact human health risk. First, the route of exposure. The consequences of exposure to heavy metals, including mercury, lead, and cadmium, for instance, depend on whether the exposure is via the skin or the respiratory or the gastrointestinal tracts. Timing of exposure. Short-term, high-dose impacts often will not be the same as long-term, low-dose impacts, even if the total exposure and the routes of exposure are the same. For instance, a small number of severe episodes of sunburn during childhood have been found to greatly increase the risk of skin cancer, far more than multiple milder adult sunburns. Chronic low-dose exposures may produce different and more subtle impacts. Stages of life. The impact on the very young and the very old is likely to be different than the impact on people at other stages of life. We need to be especially concerned about exposures during pregnancy, early childhood, and the later years in life. Other diseases. The presence of other diseases will affect how the body is impacted by the environmental exposure. We need to be especially concerned about the environmental exposures for those with chronic lung disease and those with suppressed immune systems, such as those living with AIDS. Special sensitivities. A few individuals will be hypersensitive to specific environmental exposures that have no measurable impact on the vast majority of individuals. We need to be concerned about how to identify and protect those individuals without depriving them their right or opportunities. Risk assessment is a formal process that aims to measure the potential impact of known hazards. A hazard indicates the inherent danger of an exposure, while a risk assessment aims to take into account not only the inherent danger, but also the quantity, route, and timing of the exposure for individuals exposed in actual use. The risk assessment approach to environmental hazards represents the mainstay of our current approach. Some examples of how risk assessment has helped to decrease the burden of disease of environmental exposures include chimney sweeps and testicular cancer. There was an increased rate of testicular cancer among chimney sweeps, and upon investigation it was determined that their higher rate of exposure to carbon residues increased their testicular cancer rate. The next two examples happened about the same time during World War II. The first has to do with watch painters. A radioactive paint was created, and it was found that when you put it on the hands of a watch, you could see it in the dark. Females were hired to paint the watch hands, and to make the tip of the paintbrush very small, they would first put it in their mouths and twirl it. They would then dip the brush into paint the hands, and then repeat the process. These women suffered a greater rate of cancer, and it was determined that the unique exposure that they were experiencing was the radioactive paint. The last one has to do with the ship workers during World War II. They experienced a higher rate of lung cancer, and it was determined that their exposure to asbestos was the cause. These examples and many other similar examples are what led to risk assessments. When an exposure is determined to be harmful, Scientists work to determine what is the maximum level of exposure that is allowed before there is harm. This is an important aspect of environmental health, especially in regards to occupational health. Risk assessment is a formal process that aims to measure the potential impact of known hazards. A hazard indicates the inherent danger of an exposure, while a risk assessment aims to take into account not only the inherent danger, but also the quantity, route, and timing of the exposure for individuals exposed in actual use. The risk assessment approach to environmental hazards represents the mainstay of our current approach. The formal process of risk assessment represents the current approach to environmental hazards in the United States. This illustration describes the four-step risk assessment process as used by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA.